There's a patch of ocean south of Greenland that's getting colder, while every other part of the planet warms. Scientists call it the cold blob, and it may be the earliest visible warning of a catastrophe that reshapes civilization. Beneath the surface of the Atlantic, an invisible current moves more water than every river on Earth combined. If that current stops, and the evidence says it's already slowing, Europe freezes, monsoons collapse, and billions face famine. This is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, the AMOC, and it's now at its weakest in over 1,000 years. The vast majority have never heard of it. The fact that you're here means you're already thinking ahead. So here's the question. What happens when the engine that regulates half the planet's climate simply stops? To understand the threat, you first need to understand how the machine works, and it begins with salt. Warm surface water flows north from the tropics, carrying enormous heat toward Western Europe like a planetary radiator. This current delivers roughly 1 petawatt of thermal energy northward, about 50 times all the energy humanity produces. When that warm water reaches the far North Atlantic, it cools, evaporates, and grows saltier, becoming dramatically denser. Dense water sinks, plunging to the ocean floor, then crawling south along the bottom of the Atlantic basin. That deep, cold return flow completes a circulation loop that stretches across every major ocean basin on Earth. Wallace Broecker coined the term Great Ocean Conveyor Belt in 1987, and the name stuck for good reason. A single parcel of water takes roughly 1,000 years to complete one full lap around that global circuit. Right now, the AMOC pushes about 17 million cubic meters of water every second through the deep Atlantic. But Greenland's ice sheet is quietly undermining this entire system, dumping 300 billion tons of fresh meltwater yearly. Fresh water is lighter than salt water. It floats, refuses to sink, and chokes the engine powering the whole circulation. Kato hears about this on the news and does what anyone would. Assumes it's a problem for the distant future. The Arctic feels far away. The forecast looks normal. Hasn't the climate always changed? That instinct is dangerously wrong. Since the mid-20th century, the AMOC has already weakened by 15%. 3 million cubic meters per second, gone. Proxy reconstructions confirm the circulation powering Europe's climate is now at its weakest in at least 1,600 years. Here's something that surprised me while researching this. One of the most elegant feedback loops anywhere in nature. When sea ice forms in the Arctic, the freezing process squeezes salt from the crystal structure, a phenomenon called brine exclusion. That expelled salt makes the surrounding water denser, helping power the deep water formation that feeds the entire conveyor. It's beautifully self-reinforcing. The ocean freezes, concentrates its own salt fuel, sinks, and pulls warm water northward to begin again. For millions of years, this cycle has hummed along in quiet balance, one of Earth's most patient and powerful engines. But that balance depends on one condition: not too much fresh water flooding in at once, which is exactly what's happening now. Imagine you're living in Northern Europe, and the AMOC weakens beyond recovery. What do you actually feel changing first? Winters grow longer and sharper. Climate models project European temperatures dropping 5 to 15 degrees Celsius within decades. Coastal Norway could see extremes reaching -40, the kind of cold where stepping outside becomes genuinely dangerous. Quick, before I tell you, what happens to food production when an entire continent cools that drastically? Britain currently farms 32% of its land. After AMOC collapse, that crashes to 7%, a 78% loss. What would you do if you saw this coming? Stockpile and prepare in place? Or focus on relocating somewhere warmer? An AMOC collapse shifts the intertropical convergence zone southward, dragging the planet's tropical rain belt off its normal course. West African monsoon rainfall drops 29%. India's summer monsoon weakens by 19%. Crops fail across 2 continents. Globally, land suitable for wheat shrinks by 58% and maize by 59%. Threatening food security for billions. Along the U.S. East Coast, dynamic sea level rise could add up to 1 meter on top of existing thermal expansion. AMOC variability already drives 30 to 50% of coastal flood days along the American Southeast at current strength. Now, let me show you something genuinely wonderful about this system before we go any deeper into worst-case territory. The Gulf Stream, the current nearly everyone pictures when they hear about ocean circulation, isn't driven by temperature or salt. It's powered by wind, racing north at up to 9 kilometers per hour, pushing 30 million cubic meters per second through the Florida Straits. Even if the AMOC collapsed tomorrow, the Gulf Stream would keep flowing. You'd need to stop Earth's winds to halt it. The AMOC adds 4 to 10 degrees of coastal warming to Western Europe. Meaningful, but the wind-driven current beneath it survives regardless. It's strangely beautiful. The most powerful ocean current on Earth just keeps going, driven by forces far older and stronger than any climate. But here's the problem nobody talks about. Every projection I've shown you assumes the AMOC weakens slowly, over comfortable decades. It doesn't weaken slowly. The AMOC has only 2 stable states, fully on and fully off. No gradual middle ground exists. Physicists call this the stomal bifurcation, first described in 1961. 2 competing feedbacks that allow only 2 outcomes, nothing in between. Once the tipping point is crossed, hysteresis locks the system in its collapsed state. Recovery would take centuries to thousands of years. This isn't theoretical. The AMOC has crashed catastrophically before, and the evidence is frozen in ancient ice cores. 12,900 years ago, a massive pulse of meltwater flooded the North Atlantic and nearly killed the circulation. The Younger Dryas cooled Greenland by up to 15 degrees, and the temperature plunge may have taken just 3 years. 3 years, not centuries, not generations, from stable climate to frozen landscape, before human civilization even existed. Now picture that same collapse hitting 8 billion people, with coastal megacities and industrial agriculture stretched to their limits. In October 2024, 44 climate scientists published an open letter warning that AMOC collapse risk has been greatly underestimated. One statistical analysis places the likely collapse window around 2057, though that estimate remains actively debated among researchers. The IPCC states with only medium confidence that abrupt collapse won't happen before 2100. Medium confidence, not high. Kato looks at the same evidence you're seeing, and this time, his instinct isn't to dismiss what he's learned. If you have children, elderly parents, or anyone depending on stable food and energy, this science matters to you personally. The question isn't whether the AMOC is weakening. It is, by 15%. The question is what comes next. And here's what nobody expects. We actually have the tools to see a collapse approaching before it fully arrives. The Rapid Mooring Array has continuously measured AMOC strength at 26 degrees north since 2004. Our deep ocean early warning. The European Space Agency is planning satellite missions to monitor circulation from orbit. Early detection at planetary scale. Now you understand something that could reshape how you prepare. Something the vast majority will never learn. Remember, 1. AMOC weakening is not a distant hypothesis, but a measurable trend happening right now beneath the Atlantic. 2. Support flexible infrastructure, diversified food systems, and monitoring networks that give us advance warning of tipping points. 3. Push for emissions reductions under Paris Agreement targets. Under those limits, the probability of collapse stays low. 4. Build personal resilience through local food networks, diversified energy, and awareness of climate shifts affecting your region. Kato doesn't panic, he prepares. Because the gap between catastrophe and adaptation is knowing the science before the switch flips. Type Conveyor in the comments, and share this with anyone living on a coastline or in Northern Europe. Here's the real debate. Is the greater threat the collapse itself, or the fact that most governments still aren't preparing? The AMOC may be slowing, but what happens when the ground beneath your feet starts moving instead? A supervolcano sits beneath Yellowstone. Last time it erupted, it buried half a continent in ash. That's next.